The Kennedys, An American Drama, by Peter Collier and David Horowitz. In 1976, while most of his cousins were campaigning for Sarge's abortive presidential try or Teddy's Senate re-election, David was on a 40-day binge shooting drugs. Bobby's friends, Peter Kaplan and Eric Brindle, went to David's room at Harvard, found him practically comatose and with a spiking fever, and took him to Massachusetts General Hospital. Doctors diagnosed bacterial endocarditis, a potentially fatal inflammation of the lining of the heart caused by dirty needles. At first, David recalls, there was the usual outpouring of concern. We Kennedys aren't much for the day-in, day-out thing, but we sure put out in a crisis. My mother was there, Teddy, Joe, some pretty much around the clock. They sat beside his bed in the darkened room. Muhammad Ali was called and sent David one of his robes as a get-well present. Art Buchwald came for a visit to make him laugh. But when it appeared that he would pull through, the concern began to taper off. He was hospitalized for 6 weeks. Then, as summer approached, his family designed another trip. They said I needed activity to keep my mind off things, David said. Actually, they needed me gone so I wouldn't annoy them. Bobby's old Harvard friend, Mir Bhutto, arranged for David and Doug Spooner to go to Pakistan for a visit. Shortly after arriving, the two of them were taken wild boar hunting with General Zia, who would later overthrow President Bhutto and put him to death. We were in helicopters with M-16s, honorary members of the Pakistan Rangers, Spooner recalls. It took us all day and half the night to get a boar, but finally we did. While we were up in Peshawar looking at the Khyber Pass, Gaddafi arrived in Pakistan. Bhutto got the idea that it would be good for a Gaddafi and a Kennedy to meet. So he had Gaddafi fly up and we met him and had this brief conversation. Gaddafi's entourage was extremely nervous, jumping to anticipate his every need. Afterward, we flew out of Peshawar in a staff plane behind Gaddafi. A lot of his people were on the plane with us. One of them came up and asked David what he thought of their leader. David gave them his drug grin and said, "Well, I think the guy's a little unpredictable." Every Libyan in the plane began to laugh hysterically. Back home, David sank deeper and deeper into a nightmare world, a world which had come to resemble what was supposed to be the normative Kennedy world turned inside out. He dropped out of Harvard and devoted himself almost exclusively to scoring heroin. He spent a good deal of time in the Roxbury ghetto. My father was concerned about blacks in one way, he would say later, and I was concerned about them in another, as people from whom I could get drugs. One day a black dealer told him he'd meet him in a public toilet to make a transaction. When David showed up, the man overpowered him, tied him up, and tried to stab him with a knife. David jumped back so that the knife only sliced him along the abdomen and managed to get away. Later on, after his wound healed, he was disappointed that the scar wasn't more severe. I was modeling myself on the James Caan character in The Gambler. I saw that movie over and over. I loved the last scene where Caan had finally pushed things so far that the black guy cut his face, and then he goes to the mirror and sees the wound and smiles. I could relate to that. When he was released from the hospital after his endocarditis, his family had gotten him a psychiatrist, Lee Macht, a 39-year-old boy wonder who had been commissioner of the Massachusetts Mental Health Department and was chief of psychiatry at Cambridge Hospital. After the knifing in Roxbury, Macht, worried about David's compulsive risk-taking, agreed to prescribe Percodans to keep him out of dangerous places. David's reaction was to use more and more drugs. In April 1978, he bought an ounce of cocaine, which he had planned to sell, but instead went to a girlfriend's house and started shooting the cocaine with Dilaudid, a morphine surrogate. When the cocaine wore off, the Dilaudid took over. The girlfriend came into her bedroom, where David was sleeping, and was unable to wake him. She called Spooner, who saw that David had OD'd, and rushed him to the hospital, where he was revived. Afterward, recuperating at Spooner's, David was called on by the group he had begun to think of as the Committee to Keep David Out of the Picture. Teddy, Steve Smith, Richard Goodwin, Robert Coles, his brother Joe, and his elder sister Kathleen. They all persuaded him to agree to let Kathleen be his guardian, and then sent him to McLean's, the same place Chris had gone earlier to deal with his drug problem. It looked like the Ritz on the outside and the snake pit on the inside, David recalls. The first thing I saw when I went in there was a guy on all fours barking like a dog. Literally. That's when I knew I was in trouble. He managed to get a call out to Kathleen. She came to visit and started crying when she saw his surroundings. She promised to have him out that afternoon, but she didn't come back for 3 days, and then told him, "The others say not to trust you, that you'll say anything to get out." When David asked her how long he'd be there, she replied that she didn't know. 3 weeks later, David was released and sent to Sussex, England, to become a patient of Dr. Margaret Patterson, a Scottish surgeon who had invented what she called neuroelectric therapy. One of her most celebrated patients, Who guitarist Peter Townsend, had endorsed the procedure, which involved wearing a Walkman-like headset emitting signals to the brain that Patterson theorized affected drug dependence. For David, who wore this appliance while living with a family of English evangelicals who spoke in tongues during moments of religious ecstasy, the experience was part of the surrealism which he was coming to accept as his own reality. His family wanted him to stay in England, but after 2 months there, he returned home. He began hanging out again. He and his brother Bobby met starlet Rachel Ward, whom David regarded, and still does, as the most beautiful woman who ever lived. The two of them took her dancing. To Bobby's chagrin, and David's surprise, she chose to go home with the younger Kennedy brother. It was an intense involvement, the first serious romance for David since Pam Kelly's injury. We had good times. She was just really getting into her acting career. I remember once we went to see The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and at one point in the movie, she let out this blood-curdling scream. "Practicing?" I asked her. Then, at another scary moment, I let out my own scream, and some guys in front of us told me to shut up. He got intensely jealous when he went to pick Rachel up one night and found Philippe Junot, recently married to Princess Caroline of Monaco, in her apartment. The three of them went to Xenon, a discotheque, although David was in a leg cast as a result of a broken ankle he had suffered while trying to join his younger brothers in a touch football game. When they sat down at the table, David saw Junot put his arm around Rachel and knocked it off. Junot, who had been trained in martial arts, leaped to his feet and started a brief fight that ended with David on the floor, bleeding from the nose. Rachel wanted to get an apartment with me and settle down, but I knew I was too fucked up. I was back on smack. She had no idea what I was up to. I don't know what she thought of all those little marks on my arms when I was naked. I guess she thought they were some odd Kennedy rash. We never talked about it. I was supplementing the heroin, 5 times the lethal dose for someone not used to it, with 40 Percodans a day. I'd go up to Boston on the shuttle and get 5 prescriptions from Lee Macht for 40 Percodans each. Then I'd go to various drugstores around town and get them filled, and come back to New York that evening with 200 pills. That was the ritual, once a week. One Wednesday, his temperature began to rise again, and he could tell he had been reinfected with endocarditis. He called Macht to arrange to go back to Massachusetts General, but before flying to Boston to be admitted, decided to go to Harlem one last time. He had been a good and regular customer, and was well known on certain blocks by his tan BMW. Because he had given his name as James, after Kahn in The Gambler, and there were several blacks named James in the drug business, dealers called him White James. This time he had trouble. As he was making his connection at the seedy, run-down Shelton Plaza Hotel, a huge black man accosted him, demanding his money, and then blocking him from leaving the lobby of the shooting gallery, while illogically shrieking, "You get out of here, don't you come in here, you honky." As the man hit David in the face repeatedly, a black woman watching the scene slipped out and called the police. "I should have just said it was no big deal and walked off," David now says, "but I was so out of it that I walked up to the cop in charge and started acting suspicious, and said I didn't want to get involved. Naturally, I was arrested, and the next day the news was all over the papers. David fucks up again." The Percodan prescriptions were found in the glove compartment of the car, leading to proceedings to strip Macht of his license. As Steve Smith was telling reporters with typical Kennedy euphemism that David was suffering from an ailment similar to drug addiction, he was on his way to Massachusetts General, where he was put on methadone to ease him off heroin. This time his endocarditis brought no outpouring of family concern. The only person close to David who visited was Rachel Ward. When she came, he locked the door of his room and they made love. In the days that followed, he wandered through the corridors of the hospital. One of the people he met was a young woman terminally ill with cancer. They talked a few times. He arranged to have a friend bring him a bottle of champagne, which he took to the girl's room. They drank it and made love. She died not long afterward. While David was at Massachusetts General, he received another visit from the committee to keep David out of the picture. This time they wanted a lifetime guardianship over him. He refused to sign the papers, but fearing that they would have him recommitted to McLean's, he did agree to give them control for 6 months. A judge oversaw the proceedings at his bedside. I was hooked to an IV, and I told them to get the hell away from me so I wouldn't have to hear all the legal garbage. I told them that from an objective point of view, I found it rather interesting that the only time anybody ever gave a damn was when I fucked up.